My next guest is Phyllis Fagel. She is a K-8 counselor, therapist, and author of Middle School Matters. She lives in Bethesda, Maryland, with her husband and 3 children. Phyllis has worked in both public and private schools with students in grades K through 12. She currently works full-time as a school counselor for Sheridan School in Washington, D.C., and provides therapy to children, teens, and adults in private practice at the Chrysalis Group, Inc. Phyllis is the author of Middle School Matters and a journalist. She is a frequent contributor to the Washington Post, focusing on counseling, parenting, and education, and writes the Career Confidential Weekly Advice for PDK International for Educators and the Meaningful Middle column for AMLE, which is the Association of Middle Level Educators. She has also written for Psychology Today and numerous other publications. Thank you for being on the podcast, Phyllis.
Thanks for having me.
So in the pre-chat, we talked a lot about being in the trenches, and you talked a little bit about your non-linear path to education. Can you share a little bit about how you got in to working as a school counselor?
Yeah, sure. So when I graduated college, I actually thought I was going to go to law school and went to work for a consulting firm within a law firm. And so I did a lot of crisis counseling and legal support work, and very quickly discovered that I did not want to be a lawyer. And I very much recommend that people try out a career before they enter it in the first place. And then I decided to go to journalism school. So my path to school counseling actually was pretty nonlinear. I worked in journalism and magazine publishing for about a decade, then had kids, and when my second kid was a baby, I went back to school to become a school counselor, and have not looked back since. But subsequently, about 8-9 years after I returned to counseling, I combined it with journalism. And so now, as you read in that intro, thank you, I write for the Post and I write for other publications as well. So it's all come full circle.
Yes, it's great that you're able to use both passions now and just write about your experiences in education. And because this podcast is called Out of the Trenches, we talked a lot about a story that you have about being in the trenches and working in a bureaucracy. Could you share a little bit about that story?
Sure. So I worked in a really large district that had probably 40 middle schools, not to mention high schools, elementary schools. And in order to do research, you had to go through the central office. And there was a really complicated procedure you had to follow. You had to do human subject training to make sure that you were operating ethically. You had to fill out paperwork after paperwork. And what I was trying to do is document that teaching kids not just mindfulness for stress reduction, but actually teaching them a critical skill that would help them feel more confident would be more effective than just doing the mindfulness alone. And so I partnered with Georgetown and with my principal, who was trained to do CPR instruction and wanted to collect data. And the main reason I wanted to collect that information was to help kids, not just at my school, but I thought if I had data, we might be able to get funding to implement the programming at other schools. And little did I know that I was embarking on a multi-month, several hundred volunteer hour project to collect this information. And at the end of everything, I was told that I could not do the research because I could not work with students in my school, which clearly was information we had on day one. And at the time, I was incredibly frustrated. I felt like I had done all of this work for nothing. I had roped in colleagues and felt so bad that I had asked them to give their time to this project as well, and they unwittingly ended up in the same predicament as me, which was feeling like it was all for naught. And I had been fairly meek in general throughout my career. I'm non-confrontational. It was really the first time I was so upset about something, and keep in mind I was about 41 at the time, and it was the first time I wrote to the ombudsman, and I really was trying to figure out a way around this, which just seemed so ridiculous at the time. And ultimately, I was unable to do the research. But what I wanted to share from that story is what I learned from it personally, which isn't a negative takeaway. I could really get stuck thinking about how upsetting it was to do all of that work for nothing. But really, what I learned is that when you are operating in a large bureaucracy, you
Mhm.
have to figure out how to get the end result in a different way. And now looking back on it, I ultimately ended up incorporating a lot of that information into my book. But what I had learned is that for me, I needed to also have an outside pursuit. I needed to be able to feel some ownership over the work I was creating. It's around that time that I really picked up my freelance work.
Mhm.
But I also learned that when reflecting back on it, that what felt like a gargantuan failure at the time was just, it was really almost, I would say, humiliating that it happened that way, and especially since I didn't have complete support within my school. And so I had jumped through so many hoops to try to make it happen, and was just earnest and really felt that if I cared hard and worked hard that it would work out. And so it was so deflating when it didn't. But I look back now and I think I might still be sitting in a closet crunching numbers, trying to figure out how to do research. It really wasn't the best use of my energy or my talents anyway.
Mhm.
And subsequently, I've been able to share a lot of that information with a broader population anyway. But I do think that some of the hardest experiences we have, particularly when we're in a bureaucracy, particularly when we're low on the totem pole and don't necessarily have any power of our own, can almost stop us in our tracks, and it can really contribute to losing your confidence and to becoming far more risk averse. And so I want to just encourage everyone to, rather than looking at those setbacks as a signal that you should stop in your tracks, or that you shouldn't take those risks, or that you shouldn't advocate for change, but you may need to get more creative and come up with other ways to get the same end result.
Yeah, I think it's great how you pointed out that you hadn't gone to the ombudsman until you were that this long into your career, and that's something a lot of educators, they're afraid. They're afraid to speak up. They're afraid to go to the union or the ombudsman. They're afraid what might happen, right? They're afraid the repercussions, and at some point, you need to stand up for yourself. And as you said, it didn't work out like you being able to do the research, but you felt like you were at least able to uh, get your point out there. You were able to voice what had happened to you, and now, looking back, that's a takeaway for you that you wouldn't probably be writing the articles that you do now had you still been working in that district. And you learn a lot. So it's hard when we're in that situation, when we're in the trenches, right? We think we can never get out, and we think, what was me, right? Like you said, a lot of people think they're a failure because they might be refused to do something like you, or they might not be moving up in the system, or something happens. It could be with a colleague, or some student parents. Sometimes we have conflicts with people, that are not necessarily the kids in the classroom, right? And those things can bring us down. I think just learning and resiliency, like you're talking about, means a lot.
Definitely. And I think one of the takeaways for me at that time, and I remember getting this advice from someone who I worked with, was to really think carefully about going forward whether I wanted to ask for forgiveness or permission when I was interested in pursuing a particular goal. And since then, and the irony is, at the time, I think I felt like I had nothing left to lose, that I had kind of done everything I possibly could and everything had gone wrong, and that I had hit rock bottom, and in a weird way that actually enabled me to take more risks.
Mm-hmm.
That clearly I could have fallen even lower. It always can be worse, but that was liberating for me. And I made the decision at that time that going forward, whenever I was at a crossroads, whenever I was trying to make a career decision, whether I was in a big bureaucratic organization or in a small independent school like I am now, that whatever decision I was contemplating, that I was going to really get in touch with whatever my core values were.
Mm-hmm.
And if the decision was compatible with my core values, and I ethically felt it was right, and that I felt it would serve students, that I was going to take that risk. And what I'll say is that I've had far more success and far more wind at my back, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
when I go for broke, and when I'm willing to take risks, and when I'm willing to put it all on the table than I was when I played it safe and when I was super deferential to everybody who I reported to, or when I worried so much about where I was. I've never really been a person in the school system who has any sort of power to speak of. I also haven't been interested in that. I'm far more interested in the direct services that I provide. But one of the things that I have learned through the years is that you don't necessarily do right by kids or by yourself, or do right for yourself when you are playing by the rules and when you are making sure that you're avoiding conflict at all costs. Sometimes conflict isn't such a terrible thing, and sometimes you anticipate conflict that never materializes, and you're best off just putting one foot in front of the other and doing your best to get your point across. I do think communication matters a lot. I think that sometimes we want to realize a goal or to accomplish something, and the reason we're not able to get any traction is because of breakdowns in communication. Either we're not clear about what it is that we want, or people misinterpret what we're trying to accomplish. I think that's probably more true with women, if I had to guess, especially women who are really a little bit more intense about their work. I think that's sometimes can come into play, particularly in education. But on balance, I think that we really are much more likely to help kids and help our students when we let all of that go, when we really are willing to fail and put it all on the line.
No, and I think that's great when you're being transparent and, telling how you're able to get through those experiences and not fear failure, right? Because failure is what moves us forward. So what would you say to educators who are currently feeling like they're in the trenches, or they're dealing with a conflict, maybe within their district, with a bureaucracy, maybe with a supervisor or a colleague? How would you help them move forward?
I think change is really hard, and it's really hard to take risks, particularly if you have had some setbacks or conflict with people within your organization. And I think it's at those moments when we most need change that we most fear change. I know that for me, when I was looking at taking the position I now have, which is in a K-8 after being in a middle school environment, I was petrified at the prospect of working with young children. That just seemed so scary. And I can remember saying to my principal at the time, I'm sure it can't possibly be as scary as I'm imagining it to be. And I would do some self-talk that I was really overinflating the level of risk I was assuming. The irony is actually I was taking on far more risk than I knew. When I got to my new school, I ended up teaching mindfulness to kindergartners that first year. I ultimately became a sex education and wellness teacher with middle schoolers, which was totally far afield from what I've been doing in the past. And of course, I ended up writing this book and having to go on the road and speak publicly to people all over the world, which is something that terrifies me to begin with. So the irony is I actually had more to fear, but what I have discovered is that the more you expose yourself to those fears, particularly in small doses, the more capable you are of assuming those risks and of going forward, even though you're terrified. I think sometimes we assume that we can't be brave because we have fear, when often other emotions or other driving forces, it could be clarity of purpose, it could be stubbornness, it could be really anything, can actually propel you over that fear and give you the courage you need in those moments.
No, I think those are great words of advice for educators who, are kind of lingering, right? There's a lot of people that linger. They think, well, this isn't the year to do it, or, I might want to pursue another position, or, move to a different district, but, they always put it off, right? So I think it's just trying to overcome those fears and making sure that, you're never going to know unless you try, right?
That's right. And you can pick yourself up if it doesn't work out and do something different. I was recently talking to my literary agent, who was asking me when I was going to write my next book, because the publisher was interested in that. And I've been putting it off and putting it off. And part of the reason I had been putting it off is because I secretly kind of actually wanted to write a novel next, which is
Uh-huh.
absolutely in another direction. And I think if there's any theme to my life, it's that I enjoy change more than I think I enjoy change, and I like taking on new challenges. But she said to me, maybe you should write another nonfiction book first. Maybe you should solidify this space that you have been operating and living in for a while, and continue along the same vein.
Mhm.
And my instinct was to say, yes, of course I should, because I think we have a lot of shoulds. We should
Mhm.
stay until we have our pension. We should stay until we've done X amount of years so it doesn't look like we jump around a lot, or we should stay the course, or we shouldn't do, you can come up with a gazillion different reasons why we shouldn't take a chance, or why we shouldn't do something, and why we should get off of that path. And I really had to, even now, even having learned all of the lessons I've learned, had to stop and remind myself, if I wanted to write a novel, there's nothing to say that I can't do that.
Mhm.
There's nothing that can happen, except for perhaps it doesn't get off the ground, and that's okay too.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and you have that chance already since you have that agent who's asking you about the novel as well. And you might not have written anything yet, but you have, the door's open, right? So
The door's open. I'm not sure she really would like me to write a novel, but
mm.
I joke with her. I want to write a novel about it's not even a joke. I want to write a novel about a counselor who is enlisted to work for a U.S. intelligence agency, and I think it would be a really fun story. But that's a very DC angle.
Yeah, no, I mean, use your experience and see where that goes. So we talked a lot in the pre-chat about just people that maybe have conflict among colleagues or with just the bureaucracy, and that feel they're in the trenches that way. That's often prevalent among educators working in middle schools. Why do you think that's so?
That's a really interesting question, whether or not it's more prevalent in middle schools. I think some of it is just education in general. I think in any field, and this is probably true for nonprofits in general, but I think when you're working in industries where you are not rewarded with bonuses, there's not that financial incentive, you're not promoted most of the time, most people are not on a promotion track. I think that people end up trading in things like intangibles, the perception of access to power, the perception of favoritism, the sense that your work is valued, or that somebody is coming and watching you in the classroom. I think those things take on a lot more significance in environments where there isn't other forms of extrinsic validation. And for people who struggle with functioning without that extrinsic validation, for whom it's not enough just to have your students do well, or to, and some teachers will very openly say, I need more, and I applaud them for that, for letting their supervisors know what they need. But if that is something that you need and you're not getting it, I think it can lead to some bad feelings among colleagues, and it can lead to a sense of competition. One of the things I've written about a lot is how we can raise girls, and I typically write mostly about middle school age, and about how we can raise girls who build one another up rather than tearing one another down. And not to be to hone in on one gender in particular, although education is about 80% female, and I think that I observed it a little bit more there than I have in other environments, perhaps because of the nature of the field, and perhaps because it's more female. But there is this sense, and I think society reinforces it a lot, that there's this limited pie, and that we have to battle each other out in order to get a slice of that pie. And nothing could be farther from the truth. I tell my kids all of the time, my own kids, my students, the more you support one another, the more you show up for one another, the more you're there to back one another up and root for each other and cheer each other on, the more that boomerangs back to benefit you. And I don't mean in that self-serving way, and that you should do it because it's self-serving, but it leads to feeling good. It leads to expanding the pie. Everybody thrives in an environment that's supportive. And I do think that it's incumbent on schools to really extinguish behaviors that do mimic the worst of what we hear about with middle schoolers, and I love middle schoolers, and I think they're unfairly maligned, and I don't see them as mean or drama seeking. I think they're still building those skills. But when you compare the adults when you think about the adults in that building, it's especially important that they are role models for their students. It does all trickle down. I spoke to a principal, this was probably 5 years ago. His name is Craig Vroom, and I only spoke to him one time, but we were talking, I was writing an article at the time about how to cultivate kindness and empathy among students, among middle schoolers. And he started sharing a story about staff and how when staff are not kind to one another, one of the things he had learned over the years of being a leader was that you have to vote them off the island. And I never forgot that phrasing, because I think there's a belief, particularly in schools, that a lot of people subscribe to, that it's a team structure, and that you have, which it is, but that you want to really look at it from the vantage point of the building, and, you know, what can we do to support the people in the building. And it can be easy to realize that one person in that building or a couple people in a building can really change the culture for everybody. And I think it's a bit counterintuitive, but I think that if we all look bigger beyond the building itself, but to how we fit into the larger society, kind of like sharing that research with other schools, if we think about what behavior we expect, not just within the building, but just in general, we're more likely to target those behaviors and to address them directly.
No, I think that's so well pointed out about school culture, because we know, you know, whatever the students see going on amongst adults, you know, they're not blind. They will pick up on that. And if there's conflicts amongst colleagues, there's going to be conflict among the kids as well. So,
yeah. And I don't think that there's such a thing as a conflict-free workplace, and there's no such thing as a perfect employee, and no conflict is one-sided. So I think it's important that when we have these experiences, when we have conflict, that we take a hard and unflinching look at ourselves and at whatever we've contributed to that situation, and that we learn from it, and ideally, you know, not forget it, but maybe even teach others or share it with others, so that we pay that lesson forward. You know, we're all learning. I know when shortly after, this was also several years ago, but shortly after I left my last job, I was asked to write a workplace advice column for educators. And it was on the heels of that research project and on the heels of some other disappointments in the workplace. And I remember saying to them, I don't think I'm equipped to write this. I don't think I'm the right person, because I've made so many mistakes myself. And the editor at the time said, well, why don't you do a trial? Why don't you do a sample column and let's see how it goes? And she assigned a question that was related to workplace culture in the education workplace. And I answered it. And she came back and she said, you know, we really would like you to write this column. And well, at the time I was so insecure about doing it. What I realize now in retrospect is it's the failures that really teach us the most. It's my experiences, whatever went right, whatever went wrong, I can bring that empathy and those experiences to the column. And I've subsequently learned that there's so much commonality. A lot of the things that people worry are their own shortcomings or their own experiences or their own embarrassment or humiliation are really pretty universal. There's some things that everybody is experiencing across the board, and nothing like getting 1,000 letters from educators, from principals down to teachers, to realize that everybody is learning as they go.
Yeah, because we don't know a lot of the time other people's struggles. I was just listening to another podcast this morning about there's a mastermind for teachers, right? And the new teachers a lot of time don't get the support they need. They're on their own island. They usually are assigned a mentor teacher, but they don't sometimes get along with that person, or the person doesn't have time to reach out to them. So there was an organization that has a mastermind for teachers, new teachers, and all those teachers that were submitting comments to the Facebook to that new teacher group were all saying the same thing, right? That they were struggling, they were thinking about leaving their profession. But that's why it's so great to have networks of colleagues, such as a mastermind or type of, you know, maybe outside of the district network, where you're able to talk to like-minded colleagues or people in similar positions, because people are all dealing with the same type of struggles, right?
And students too, you know, I think when you work with students, and in my capacity as a counselor, I'm always looking to normalize their experiences, because when you normalize, you remove the shame.
Mm-hmm.
And when you remove the shame, you make it safe to ask for help. And that's what we want. We want to be teaching kids to be helpers and to be asking for help when they need assistance. And we want to be creating the same environment for teachers where it is okay to make mistakes, and it is okay to not know everything and to figure it out as you go along. And so I think that same normalizing piece that you're talking about with the mastermind groups is really an extension of what we're doing with our students all of the time.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's great to end on. Out of all the things that we talked about today, what's one thing you'd like people to remember in particular?
You know, we're all in this for the same reason, which is to turn out good people.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to turn out good people, we have to be authentic, and we have to be ourselves, and we have to be willing to admit what we've done wrong and make it safe for them to make mistakes. But we also have to own what we're good at and what we can contribute, and to feel confident about our strengths. I think often our tendency is to veer in one direction or the other, to either feel like a complete failure or to feel like you're on top of the world and then suddenly something deflates you. And to just present a more realistic presentation of what it means to be human to students and to our colleagues is really the way to go through the world in the most mentally healthy, emotionally healthy way.
Yeah, no, I think that's great to point out to those educators who are listening. Where can people find you online?
I have a website, phyllisfagel.com. I'm probably most active though on Twitter. I tweet at pfagel. And my book is Middle School Matters, and I freelance for lots of different publications, but most often for the Washington Post. Most of my articles are on my website though.
Well, thank you so much for being on the Out of the Trenches podcast. It was a pleasure talking to you today.
It was really nice talking to you too, Dana. Thank you.